Greetings. Welcome to Anti-Liars, where we always seek the truth and dispel the lies. I am your host, Howard Self. A document titled Petition to True Mother has leaked to the public. It is dated July 10th, 2026, the very day the special prosecutor requested a 13-year prison sentence for Mrs. Hak Ja Han, the maximum possible sentence. And this petition was allegedly written by Chang Shik Yang on behalf of a group of 6 elder Unification Church leaders that include Sunjo Hwang, Jun Ho Suk, No Hee Pak, Byung Hyo Son, and Kwang Ki Sa. It closes under an anonymous collective signature, the so-called, quote, representative leaders, unquote. The petition asks Mrs. Han, who as we know is in prison, to authorize an emergency countermeasure committee, demands the resignation of the current leadership, proposes a supreme council through which the petitioners would control the church's legal affairs, personnel, finances, missions, and international relations, calls for the replacement of the legal team, and asks to prepare for succession. Across 5 pages written at the moment of the gravest crisis the Unification Church has faced since its very inception, God is never mentioned. God's providence is never mentioned in any substantive sense. The true family, the central institution of the unification movement, is absent. There is not a single reference to it. The blessed families are never mentioned either, except in the name of the author's own counsel. This entire document is about themselves, their committee, their council, their authority, their restoration to power. But the petition's authors are the last people on earth with any standing to write this petition, because these are the very men who designed the structures and created the problems that produced today's collapse of the Unification Church. It is incredible irony that the most corrupt generation of leaders in the church's history, the very architects of the schism, who also brought ruin to Reverend Moon's family, his marriage, and his church, now present themselves as saviors. Our Anti-Liars response today examines who they are and what their record actually shows. One theme runs through the history that we are talking about today: incompetence. The story of the UC leadership before the schism, through Reverend Moon's passing, and in the years since, is a story of unbroken incompetence. Anti-Liars has covered that territory in many of our videos. The very same class of leaders presided over the hollowing out of the movement's mission, the expulsion of its genuine successor and most capable figure in the person of Dr. Hyunjin Moon, the collapse of the church's social standing, the dissolution order in Japan, the criminal investigations in Korea, and now the detention of the 83-year-old woman they claim to serve. At no point did they demonstrate the competence to build, to reform, or even to protect. Their single demonstrated skill is the capture and defense of institutional positions within the Unification Church. And this current shady petition is one more greedy stab at taking more control of the church. The petitioners concede that while holding senior responsibilities, they failed to establish proper principles, transparent institutions, accountability, and effective checks and balances. They admit that the structure they passed on to their replacements was defective. They concede that violations committed within that structure ultimately exposed Mrs. Han to political, social, and legal responsibility. They describe a comprehensive failure of leadership at every level, but they identify no particular decision for which they accept any responsibility. They do not name any specific UC leader who concealed information, abused funds, manipulated boards, distorted doctrine, misled Mrs. Han, persecuted members of the true family, or misused the church's assets. They offer no restitution, no disclosure, no repentance, no resignation, and no commitment to remain permanently outside positions of authority. In short, they offer no real accountability. Instead, responsibility is dissolved into vague collective language. For example, we all failed, therefore we should all return. Repentance requires truth, personal accountability, restitution, and a change of direction. Saying we bear responsibility while simultaneously requesting authority over personnel, finance, law, mission, and succession is no sacrifice at all. It is but a blatant attempt at an unprincipled comeback. This type of delusional, utterly contradictory conclusion can only exist within the UC bubble. And that is because there has never been any accountability within the UC. The central contradiction of this petition is simple. The people who acknowledge they created a dysfunctional structure now want to place that structure back under their supervision. Their sheer ambition, delusion, and incompetence displayed throughout the petition did not begin with the current criminal investigation. Their faults span the entire arc of time, both before and all through the current schism. Before the schism, senior UC leaders built a centralized bureaucracy dependent upon access to Reverend Moon, institutional titles, control over members, and control over the flow of donations. These leaders, petitioning Mrs. Han, promoted the institutional church, an institution that under them became satanic, broken, and dysfunctional when they deviated from Reverend Moon's direction to end the church. Importantly, they also did not unite with Reverend Moon's designated heir, Dr. Moon, who valiantly tried to fix the dysfunctional reality of the Unification Church. During the schism, emboldened by Kukchin, these UC leaders repeatedly treated corporate control as though it was providential legitimacy. Board control allowed them to hijack key church entities, yet they lacked the competence to improve those entities or to turn them around. Deluded and overambitious, they sought positions they were totally unqualified to hold. Instead of fixing the many organizational problems within the UC, they instead maintained control, sat on boards, and under their watch, the entities deteriorated and collapsed. As we have covered in previous videos, Mrs. Han's predicament today is the direct consequence of the structure that these UC leaders, in concert with Kukchin and Shan, as a cabal, built nearly 2 decades ago. When Kukchin was in charge of the Tongil Foundation and was subsequently placed over the Unification Church of Japan, the cabal now held control over both ends of the church's financial pipeline, the source of the money in Japan and its destination in Korea. Every yen raised from Japanese members flowed through entities that these leaders controlled. To cut off the funding Reverend Moon had earmarked for UCI and the international work assigned to Dr. Moon, the cabal reactivated a dormant foundation in Korea, the Mission Foundation, today called the Hyojong Global Tongil Foundation, and they redirected the Japanese donations into it. And in a move that combined arrogance, ambition, and absolute incompetence, they officially installed Mrs. Han as the Mission Foundation's legal chairperson, her first such legal position, with Peter Kim as Secretary General. That decision sealed Mrs. Han's fate. The legal head of an entity carries personal legal liability for everything done in its name. And what was done in the Mission Foundation's name included the diversion of Japanese members' donations away from their intended providential purposes, tens of millions of dollars gambled away in Las Vegas, lavish and unchecked spending on palaces and pet projects, and other illegal money flows that are now at the center of Korean prosecutors' investigations. The cabal bypassed the very protections that had been put in place after Reverend Moon's unjust imprisonment at Danbury to ensure that Reverend Moon nor his wife would ever again face personal legal exposure. They used Mrs. Han as the legal face of the machine that they built to capture the money. The UC clerics controlled the flows, but they left Mrs. Han holding the bag. She was left with all the liability. Today, as she sits in prison in Korea, the leaders who constructed that pipeline bear direct responsibility for putting her name on it. Regarding Chang Shik Yang, while in charge of True World Group, he used True World Group's assets to create a distribution center in Korea. This was a huge capital investment, but he put the ownership under his own name and that of one other leader. When Dr. Moon took leadership of UCI, Yang transferred the asset back to its proper owner. Had Dr. Moon not taken leadership of UCI, nobody would ever have known. Ask yourselves, how much money did leaders like Yang steal in that process? How many other businesses did he create and put under his name that failed? Where did he get that capital to begin with? Why did he think he was entitled to that? Yang was also one of the most frequent gamblers who always went to Las Vegas with Mrs. Han. One of the main charges against Mrs. Han concerns that gambling in Las Vegas because it was done with publicly donated funds. And among the names the Japanese and Korean media have linked to the casino trips are Ki-hoon Kim, Wonju Jung McDivitt, and Chang Shik Yang. The media reported that this circle moved a staggering $45 million through the casinos over the 3 years from 2008 to 2011 alone. Who was controlling the amount of cash being gambled away, and how much was pocketed by each of these UC leaders? Another charge concerns the cover-up. A corrupt government official in Korea gave the UC advance warning of an impending investigation into the gambling, buying the UC time to delete the related accounting records. That cover-up is now coming back to haunt them, and it forms a strong part of the case against Mrs. Han. If one document captures the character of the UC's clerical class, it is the written pledge that Sun Jo Hwang signed around January 2013 when Kukjin audited Hwang's operations. The irregularities and misused funds that the audit uncovered were serious enough that Hwang prostrated himself before Kukjin and begged to be spared. The pledge he signed is a remarkable artifact of self-abasement. In it, Hwang confesses to, quote, disregarding the Cain-Abel order, unquote, apologizes for his unfilial conduct toward true parents, admits in writing to, quote, faults in the conduct of his duties, and to areas that lacked transparency. And he promises to submit his finances and personnel decisions to Kukjin's oversight and audits. Set aside the irony that the audit itself was a political instrument used by Kukjin. What matters is what it revealed. Hwang was dirty. He knew he was dirty, and when threatened with exposure, this elder of the movement did not stand on principle or conscience. He groveled, signed, and pledged allegiance to whoever held the leverage over him. That is the man now positioning himself through this elder's petition as a moral guardian fit to steer the church through its gravest crisis. In reference to Jun Ho-suk, when Reverend Moon ascended in 2012, the UC leadership committed one of the most disgraceful acts imaginable. They erased Dr. Moon and his entire family from the official published list of bereaved family members at his own father's Seonghwa ceremony. Most outrageously, they mobilized church members to physically block Dr. Moon from attending his own father's funeral, which became a major scandal covered by the Korean media. The designated heir and true elder son of the true family, the man Reverend Moon had acknowledged as the fourth Adam, and who he had worked with in father-son cooperation for a decade, leading the movement to its highest peak by 2008. The man who, by every tradition of Korean custom and simple human decency, should have stood as the chief mourner at Reverend Moon's funeral, was struck from the record of his own father's funeral, together with his wife and children, Reverend Moon's own grandchildren, as though they did not exist. And the person leading these despicable acts was Jun Ho-suk, then president of the Unification Church in Korea. He bears central responsibility for those despicable actions. This is the greatest betrayal in providential history, a betrayal for which they will have to answer to heaven. As agents of Satan, they were the gravest impediment to God's providence, where Dr. Moon was appointed to lead. It takes a high order of depravity to weaponize a father's funeral against his own son, especially in the true family. The result of these leaders' actions is the present crisis of the entire movement. It is the foreseeable consequence of decades of opaque governance, doctrinal opportunism, institutional dependency, and the substitution of legal control for spiritual legitimacy. Huang, Yang, Suk, and the leaders of their generation were key leaders under Reverend Moon. For decades, they wore Reverend Moon on their sleeves, taught a distorted version of the divine principle, misrepresented and enforced directives, and built entire careers on pretending to represent Reverend Moon's authority. Then, after his passing, these same men adapted seamlessly to the new doctrinal and political environment. They became advocates and enforcers of the only begotten daughter theology, a doctrine that is anathema to the divine principle and a rejection of everything Reverend Moon taught. OBD theology elevates Mrs. Han's authority above Reverend Moon's, recast her as an independently sinless messianic figure, and overturns the very providential framework these men spent their lives preaching. The very people who should have known better and should have opposed OBD were instead the champions of it. The great religious traditions of the world were carried forward by sincere men and women of devotion who went to prison often, faced torture, exile, and death even, rather than renounce what they believed. For a sincere person of faith, conviction is the substance of their life. Measured against that standard, the conduct of these UC leaders reveals exactly what they are. To them, belief was never a true conviction. Belief was but an instrument, something to latch onto for institutional power and to discard when it stopped being useful. Men who really believed what they preached for 40 years could not flip their theology overnight. But men who believed in nothing but their power and position could and did. The irony is that even their professed devotion to Mrs. Han is a fraud. A sincere member who accepts her authority actually believes her words. These leaders do not. They will preach whatever doctrine the person controlling the institution requires, precisely because they never believed in or answered to God. Their God is institutional control. The wholesale conversion of Reverend Moon's senior leadership to OBD theology is the very proof of their insincerity, and it disqualifies every appeal to loyalty and faith that the petitioners make. They are criminals cloaking themselves in religion to advance their twisted and unprincipled goals. These UC leaders present themselves as guardians of Reverend Moon's legacy while pledging their lives to Mrs. Han. But the collapse of the Unification Church was engineered through manufactured doctrines, and the manufacturing was done by the generation of clerics now petitioning for emergency powers, with the petition signatories personally at the center of it. Each doctrine sounded benign to unsuspecting members. However, each doctrine was designed to undermine Adamic authority, uproot Reverend Moon's lineal succession, and secure an apostolic succession within a church institution the clerics themselves would control. First, manufactured doctrine, the divinity of the true parents. The clerics promoted the idea that the true parents were infallible, all-knowing, and possessing godlike status. That doctrine served them twice over. By making every utterance of Reverend Moon absolute, they erased the distinction between his consequential principle teaching and providential mandates on the one hand, and his mundane remarks about daily church affairs and life on the other. The latter they could manipulate, manufacture, and weaponize at will. And since a deity requires mediators, they installed themselves as the intermediary clerics, through which the divine words would flow to the members. The doctrine of true parents' divinity flatly contradicts the divine principle, the very text these men taught for decades. The principle states plainly that the messianic figure is human. Quote, "While on earth, Jesus was a man no different from any of us, except for the fact that he was without the original sin." Divine Principle, Chapter 7, Section 2-3. Reverend Moon himself dismantled the deification framework with one sentence, quote, "Some say that the Messiah is God, and God is the Messiah. This is wrong," unquote. Reverend Moon, January 24th, 1989, at the Ilwa Yongin factory. Understand what the clerics discarded when they deified the founder against his own words. The entire purpose of the divine principle is the restoration of the human family through a human Adamic figure who perfects himself, establishes a true family, and then engrafts fallen humanity back into God's lineage, with every person bearing their own portion of responsibility as co-creators of God's kingdom. That all requires alignment, responsibility, and the true family at the center. It requires no church and no clerics. Second, manufactured doctrine, the co-equal status of Reverend Moon and Mrs. Han. Divinization had a more targeted purpose. The clerics applied divinity to the true parents as a pair, and by that device elevated Mrs. Han, 24 years younger than her husband, and standing in the position of Eve from the fallen lineage, to a status equal to Reverend Moon himself. Nothing in the divine principle supports this. In the principle's order of restoration, the Adamic figure stands in God's direct lineage, and the bride must be restored and recreated through him. Quote, "The Messiah is a man. A man. Then what is the woman? The woman was made through Adam and modeled after Adam. It means that she was created because of Adam. So the Messiah must come to this fallen world and find Eve there. Eve, who was taken away by Satan," unquote. Sermons of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, Volume 128, page 93, June 1983. And another quote, "Then, when looking at the principle of recreation, how should the woman be restored? She must be recreated through Adam," unquote. Reverend Moon's Sermons, Volume 115, page 133, November 1981. Reverend Moon defined his wife's position and responsibility with a clarity that leaves no room for co-equality. Here is a very important quote from the Sermons of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, Volume 18, page 271. Mother should follow father. For mother, everything works out if she absolutely unites with father. This is because the fall occurred when Eve reversed dominion on Adam. To restore this, Eve must completely obey Adam. Mrs. Han's portion of responsibility, which no one, including God himself, nor her husband, could fulfill on her behalf, was to have absolute unity with Reverend Moon. The clerics knew all of this very well. They often witnessed the rebukes from Reverend Moon towards Mrs. Han firsthand, and their response was to hide them from the members and to keep repeating the lie of total unity, because the entire edifice of a deified true parents to be worshiped like God would collapse if members learned the true parents were not united. Third manufactured doctrine, the three sons succession model. Reverend Moon settled succession. At Dr. Hyunjin Moon's inauguration in 1998, he declared the significance of the moment in unmistakable terms. Listen to his words. We must understand how miraculous it is that the era of the fourth Adam has just started. Finally, from God's point of view, 3 generations have been restored, and now the era of the fourth Adam can begin. That is the significance of this inauguration today. You can receive the era of the fourth Adam through Hyunjin's family, unquote. Reverend Sun Myung Moon, July 1998. The 3 kingships and the era of father-son cooperation were centered on elder sonship, one son representing the God-centered family. It was never 3 sons. Reverend Moon said, quote, on earth, you must unite, centering on Hyunjin, unquote. Reverend Moon's Sermons, Volume 335. Yet, from around 2005, the clerics propagated the perception that the true parents' design was for 3 sons to divide the movement's leadership, positioning one sibling over religious affairs and another over the businesses. No teaching of Reverend Moon supports this model. Its purpose was purely mechanical. Manufacture a separation of powers among the sons, exploit the siblings' ambitions by treating them as useful idiots, and thereby dilute and eventually eliminate the authority of the one son Reverend Moon had actually recognized as successor and Adamic figure. The clerics spread this invention as though it were true parents' gospel, and they could only do so under the patronage of the woman they had first propped up as co-equal. The fourth manufactured doctrine, everyone is the fourth Adam. Having divided the succession among 3 sons, the clerics then dissolved it entirely, teaching members that all blessed families were fourth Adams in their own right. Sanjo Huang, a signatory of the present petition, promoted exactly this to the membership as the Family Fed International President, writing in the April-May 2004 edition of Today's World that the Jardim training course existed to create fourth Adams, and that members must become fourth Adams standing on their own two legs with faith to become messiahs themselves. Measure what Huang said against what Reverend Moon told Huang personally by name. Quote, Sanzhou Huang cannot be in charge of everything in the future. Since I have children, you should follow my children, right? Do you understand? Yes. Therefore, Hungjin works with the archangel from spirit world, and on earth you must be united, centered on Hyunjin. You must unite, centered on Hyunjin's family, and through them you can come to parents, unquote. Reverend Moon's Sermons, Volume 335, October 2000. Reverend Moon's vision that blessed families could aspire to fourth Adam-like ownership in this era presupposes their absolute unity with the actual fourth Adam, as restored Cain, participating in the messianic mission through him. Blessed families come from fallen lineage and stand as adopted children. Again, Reverend Moon, because you were born as children of the archangel, in order for you to return to the position of becoming a son, you have to first be in the position of adoptive children and attend to my direct son as your elder brother. You must attend to my direct son as your elder brother. Sermons of the Reverend Moon, Volume 120, October 1982. Huang and the clerics twisted this into its opposite, a flattering half-truth, telling every member they were fourth Adams, which conveniently meant no member needed the son Reverend Moon had recognized as the fourth Adam, and every member needed only the church. The clerics were appointed by Reverend Moon as John the Baptist figures with one primary responsibility: to testify to Dr. Moon's identity before the membership and the world. And each of them promised Reverend Moon directly to his face to do so. Instead, they raised false idols as supposed successors and taught the members a counterfeit principle, precisely so that God's true Son would go unrecognized. Divinization, co-equality, three sons as successors, everyone being a fourth Adam. Each one inverted the core teachings of Reverend Moon and the divine principle. Each one was propagated by the UC clerics while Reverend Moon was alive and in defiance of his explicit, repeated, personally delivered instructions. And each one served a self-serving end, replacing the providential movement Reverend Moon founded, which required no church institution because the providence advanced through the true family, with a worship institution that could never exist without its clerical class. Chang Shik Yang, the author of this present petition, personally read to Reverend Moon at Sokcho in March of 2009 a fake spirit world message proclaiming that Reverend Moon and Mrs. Han now stood before heaven with equal status. Yang later admitted that he had written the fake document himself. It was composed and staged to dupe an elderly Reverend Moon into believing it genuinely came from the spirit world. The man who tried to fabricate co-equality into the church's canon through deception while Reverend Moon was alive is the same man now drafting petitions to the only begotten daughter while she now sits in prison. The co-equality doctrine was a political calculation to install Mrs. Han as the surviving half of a divine pair after Reverend Moon's passing, so that lineal succession could be dislodged and the clerics could rule through her. OBD theology, which today claims her lineage superior to Reverend Moon's and her status independent of him, is simply that doctrine carried to its final form. Wang taught the members they were all fourth Adams, after promising Reverend Moon to his face that he would unite with his son. This generation of two-faced leaders destroyed the Unification Church, not despite their professions of devotion to Reverend Moon, but by means of them, invoking his name at every step while dismantling everything he taught and had created. These leaders wore him on their sleeves then, and they wear Mrs. Han on their sleeves now. And in both cases, they do so for one purpose only: their own position, their own institution, their own survival. Notice what the petition cares about: boards, committees, legal mandates, authority over personnel. It is like an obsession. To thwart the Adamic figure, the UC leadership wholly adopted Kukjin Moon's board control strategy, the doctrine that whoever controls the corporate board controls the church. It was a satanic, counter-providential orientation. Its purpose from the beginning was to bypass and ultimately do away with the goodwill and spiritual authority of the Adamic figures in the movement. Under this strategy, providential legitimacy was replaced by corporate mechanics. Legal control replaced spiritual authority. A movement founded on the premise that God works through central figures and central families was converted into a portfolio of entities that could be seized and hijacked by a boardroom of UC leaders. This current petition is the purest expression of that playbook yet written. Confronting a spiritual catastrophe, its authors can imagine no response except a new committee with total control over legal affairs, personnel, and finance. Why do these UC leaders cling so desperately to the UC institution? Because they are unemployable outside of it. The UC bubble is the only economy in which people of their limited ability can hold rank, since inside the bubble, position is conferred by an old boys network of corrupt elders and a crooked system of nepotism through which they have enriched themselves and their families off the backs of the members. That is why the petition's sole concern is saving the UC entity. The church entity was and is their lifeline. The bubble they defend is a delusional one, populated by incompetent leaders of outsized ambition who have made massive amounts of money by exploiting the donations and goodwill of sincere members. Grifting off the institution is the only livelihood they really know. The members sacrificed for God's providence. The leadership class harvested those sacrifices as a livelihood. Even the tone of their petition betrays them. No anguish for God's providence. No concern for the true family. Only alarm that their doomed institution, their breadbasket, might not survive. Dr. Hyunjin Moon posed a mortal threat to that breadbasket, and he threatened it by doing exactly what his father instructed. As fourth Adam, Dr. Moon walked in lockstep with Reverend Moon's directives to advance God's providence. He emphasized the centrality of the true family. He called on members to leave behind the UC baggage and embrace their identity as providential people, as blessed central families, rather than as unificationists belonging to a unification church. He moved the work beyond sectarianism and expanded the message of one family under God to the entire world. In doing so, he was dismantling the institutional framework that the leaders had lived off, all on his father's instructions. And Dr. Moon was the one man whose capacity and capability no one could dispute. Reverend Moon himself recognized his son as the one who could carry on the movement, saying that Dr. Moon was more polished, more educated, that he had charisma, sincerity, credentials, everything required to advance the mission. As far as his father was concerned, and as far as the outside world was concerned, Dr. Moon was leading the movement. But to describe Dr. Moon merely as Reverend Moon's son and successor is to miss what was actually at stake. It is the same mistake the UC leadership makes to this day. Dr. Moon was recognized as an Adamic figure, anointed by God and acknowledged by his father. That means he is not simply the son or a son of Reverend Moon. He is God's son, just as Reverend Moon is God's son. From the providential viewpoint, both stand as Adamic figures, and the determination of who carries that mantle is never a human one. Reverend Moon did not make his son an Adamic figure. That determination comes from God alone, which is precisely why Reverend Moon acknowledged his son rather than appointed him. What passed on to Dr. Moon was not an organizational title or a family inheritance, but the messianic mantle itself. And he has been carrying it ever since, realizing the providential goals Reverend Moon laid out and advancing God's providence in the world. This is what the UC leaders then and now could not and would not grasp because they do not have real faith. In their minds, ultimate authority resided in Reverend Moon himself and later in Mrs. Han herself, a person they saw to be captured, flattered, and divinized. But neither Reverend Moon nor Mrs. Han was ever the ultimate authority. The ultimate authority is God. And so when the leadership schemed to remove Dr. Moon, they were doing far more than pushing out an inconvenient heir. They were actively defying God's providence and setting themselves against God's recognized son. So why would these inept leaders scheme to get rid of the most competent, credible, and principled figure the movement had? Any organization whose actual purpose was the advancement of God's providence would have treasured him. The answer is that advancing the providence was never the leadership's purpose. They lived in the UC bubble. Their care began and ended with maintaining their breadbasket. And the man dismantling it, however recognized, however capable, however faithful to Reverend Moon's own direction, simply had to go. They have worked continuously throughout the schism to remove their greatest threat. And that is why they are in total decline and complete ruin today. An organization can survive and eventually overcome bad management, scandal, even persecution. It cannot survive setting itself against God's providence. UC leaders and members today lament the collapse of the Unification Church, the dissolution in Japan, the criminal investigations in Korea, the exodus of members of all generations. But their lamentation is misplaced. The collapse is the consequence, not the tragedy. What they should be lamenting is the cause, that they betrayed God, betrayed God's recognized Son, and betrayed God's providence, and that everything now falling down around them follows from that betrayal. The deeper misdirection preceded the schism by decades. Reverend Moon said many times that he did not come to create a new religion. The movement he founded was a messianic, charismatic, and providential movement with God at the center, working through the Adamic figure and the true family to have a transformational impact on society and civilization itself. The leaders under Reverend Moon pursued the opposite goal. Across the church institutions, including the Unification Theological Seminary, they worked to build a new religious movement, seeking recognition as a new religion of the world with its own clergy, seminary, liturgy, and denominational identity. The doctrinal engine of this project was the divinization of true parents, converting the founders into objects of worship whom only the institution could mediate. As was mentioned earlier, divinization is the complete opposite of what Reverend Moon taught through the divine principle, and it was the preferred doctrinal form of worship by these same UC leaders precisely because a deified founder requires a permanent priesthood, and these leaders had appointed themselves as that priesthood. The errant goal was entirely self-made, and it misdirected the church away from the providential and messianic movement it was meant to be. This was the situation Dr. Moon inherited when he took charge in 1998. His focus as he took on a public role was to dismantle the denominational church machinery and reorient every organization under the banner of one family under God. That work entailed correcting the foundational error of the first generation leaders and returning the movement to what Reverend Moon actually intended. The UC leaders' war against Dr. Moon was the self-made church defending itself against the man who was single-handedly trying to restore the original messianic mission. Today, the second-generation leaders claim they are reforming the UC, but these are the same people who staffed and ran the UC machine for close to 2 decades now, first under Shan and Kukjin, then under Young Ho Yoon. They worked behind the scenes under the inept first-generation leaders. When Young Ho Yoon fell, the second generation laid all the blame on him, apologized to the public, and rebranded themselves as reformers. And now they are repeating the same mistakes as the first generation. They treat the UC as a bureaucracy to be protected and controlled. A church is not simply a corporation. It exists to follow God, uphold its founders' teachings, serve humanity, and work for a purpose greater than itself. Religious organizations run on faith, conscience, sacrifice, and goodwill. That higher purpose is why society gives them special trust and tax-exempt status. Yet, faced with scandals and criminal investigations. This new breed of second-generation UC leadership proudly announced that the UC was the first religious organization in Korea to receive an anti-corruption and compliance certification. They do not realize how out of touch, tone deaf, and insincere they came across to society at large. There is a reason virtually no religious institution pursues anti-corruption certifications. It's because what comes first for any other religion is faith, moral responsibility, and goodwill. But for the UC's second-generation leaders, spiritual purpose, belief, and goodwill no longer matter. Like the first-generation leaders before them, they replaced faith and moral responsibility with bureaucratic controls designed to preserve the institution and their own positions. Their bureaucratic controls include employment contracts, compliance systems, and Korean labor law procedures. They proudly proclaim to Korean society that the UC is the first religion to obtain such certification, but this is not an achievement. It is an admission of what the church has become. They wear the cloak of religion and wrap themselves in claims of a higher purpose, yet their real concern is the survival of their little bureaucracy and their own place within it. Finally, the legal catastrophe itself. The strategy the UC pursued in the Korean investigation was designed to save the leaders themselves and to save the people paying the legal fees, Wonju Jung McDivitt among them, all at Mrs. Han's expense. This is one glaring fact that everyone outside the UC knows, yet those within the UC have refused to come to terms with. The investigation did not have to reach Mrs. Han. It could have stopped with a sacrificial lamb. One of the people under her could have taken responsibility, but none of them did. They threw her under the bus. Young Ho Yoon, Wonju Jung McDivitt, or another responsible figure could have stepped forward, admitted their own wrongdoing, and acknowledged that they never properly counseled Mrs. Han on the legal risk of the actions they were taking. Actions that they came up with and recommended to her when they asked for and obtained Mrs. Han's permission and signature. An admission like that would have contained the matter at the operational level where it really belonged. That was the honorable path, and it was available at one point. But they refused to take the honorable path. Even mobsters and gangsters retain enough loyalty to fall on their own swords for their boss. Yet, the UC leadership, people who profess the religious conviction that Mrs. Han is their Messiah, could not meet the ethical standard of mobsters and gangsters. Instead, they gave answers, gave information, and constructed a legal strategy whose organizing principle was their own survival, forcing the investigation to expand upward until it engulfed Mrs. Han herself. She now sits in detention, facing a 13-year prison sentence because those around her decided at every decision point that she was more expendable than they were. These UC leaders even recorded their conversations with her, recordings later used against her in court and kept as insurance for themselves. Those recordings by these greedy UC leaders were the smoking gun that sealed Mrs. Han's fate. And the self-sabotage continues to this day. The petition pleads, quote, "We petition for the organization of an emergency countermeasure committee and prostrate ourselves in supplication that you grant your royal assent as soon as possible. Set aside the pathetic, sycophantic language that runs through the entire petition, the idiom of groveling eunuchs whose faith has curdled into flattery. With their petition, the UC leaders performed in public the very thing Mrs. Han's defense is trying to deny. They appear entirely unaware of how foolish and how damaging an act of self-sabotage this is. In the ongoing trial, her defense team and the Family Federation's own witnesses have argued that Mrs. Han did not know of the organized acts committed by Young Ho Yoon and others and never directed or approved them. Yet, Yang and his colleagues have now demonstrated to the world through their petition that even granular personnel matters and organizational restructuring are submitted to Mrs. Han for her personal approval. This hands powerful credibility to the claims of the Young Ho Yoon faction, who testified in court that, quote, everything was reported to Mrs. Han through Chief Secretary Wanju Jung McDivitt and received her approval, unquote. It further corroborates the special prosecution's theory. Mrs. Han is directly involved in operational decisions. The people who vowed to protect Mrs. Han have instead again handed the court ever greater evidence for her aggravated punishment. In conclusion, the petition's authors belong to the generation that abandoned Reverend Moon's teachings for the only begotten daughter theology, that traded spiritual authority for board control, that expelled the one successor everyone recognized in order to protect their breadbasket, that warped a providential movement into a self-worshiping church against the founders' stated intent, that raised a second generation as fake and self-dealing as themselves, and whose legal strategy resulted in an 83-year-old woman in prison. Now, with the institution collapsing, they ask her to hand them emergency powers over everything that remains. How ridiculous could they be? This petition should be condemned because it documents how the UC leadership class is incompetent at everything except self-preservation and insincere about everything except its own selfish appetite. The collapse they offered to manage is the collapse they caused. Nothing good in the church's future can be built on such faithless men. All the members deserve to see these UC leaders plainly for what they are. See them for what they are, as Reverend Moon did when he described them in his last recorded Hundoke, that they are worse than Lucifer. Thank you for watching today's podcast. Tune in to the next Anti-Liars podcast, where we promise to always seek the truth and dispel the lies. God bless you and your family.